Hey everybody, this is Sarah and welcome back to the Indie Music Grounds. This is actually a video that I've been looking to make for quite some time on this channel. You know, it's always something that I push the idea around and always kind of had a rough draft of this video in my head and was finally inspired to make it after watching another video this weekend. And the video was very interesting because the whole idea was behind music's, quote, staying power and what constituted and made, in this case, a particular song able to stand the test of time. It was really interesting because it just really showed how, you know, a lot of times songs had to kind of fit somewhere in the middle where it couldn't be too extreme, where it would be kind of just like a timepiece of a song, you know, and then at the same time, if it was too generic or almost too boring, it didn't really go anywhere either. So it kind of just had to hit this sweet spot right in the middle. And on top of seeing that video, there's been a lot of videos lately that I've been watching about kind of the downfall of Hollywood, which we're going to get into a little bit later into this video as well. But, you know, a lot of people are seeing a lot of movies underperform, and they kind of just wonder why that's happening. I mean, a big reason for it is just kind of bigger movies nowadays by big companies not reaching the attention and the heart of the common man anymore. But like I said, we're going to get into that a little bit later. And we're going to get into why that idea fits into the narrative of why indie music is important and it needs to stick around and not go anywhere. So, before we get into all that, the important thing that we need to figure out almost right away in this video is, well, what is indie music exactly? And that question has always kind of plagued me on this channel, you know, because there is a lot of artists that I've done on this channel so far that, yeah, they are constituted indie, but then at the same time, a lot of people know that this artist is very popular. So, you know, they would question like, well, is this really an indie band? Is it not an indie band? You know, and so by and large, the whole concept of indie, what that is it's an artist, it's a musical artist that had not signed on to a major record label or a major record company, right? They're independent. That's where the name came from. And I've always been very loose with the term indie music, and if a band or if a song or whatever fits the description of indie. And honestly, I'm probably going to continue being a little bit loose with that definition as well. Because let me share with you one example of why it's really hard to just kind of outright say this band or music is indie. Right? And it's something that I've already talked about on the channel, and that is especially when their papers and neighbors as an indie band. In fact, as I said in the video about Death Cab for Cutie, they are probably amongst one of the most popular indie band, quote unquote popular indie bands of all time. You know, like, you can't really think of anybody else like them. I even think of another example of Arcade Fire, which is a band that I'm going to be talking about pretty soon on this channel as well. You know, it's the same thing. Especially in their beginning days, not a lot of people knew about them, but I think especially since The Suburbs won all those Grammy Awards and the band got massive. You know, even nowadays, they don't perform in small events. They can't perform in small events because they're extremely popular. They have to perform at huge venues. But again, at the same time, if you were to ask, you know, well, would you see them as an indie rock band? I would say, well, absolutely I would. You know, they are probably one of the most biggest indie bands that are out there. So what am I getting at with all this, right? Well, again, it's just so hard to just fit a band into a box, you know, to say like, okay, yes, this band is indie. No, this band is not indie. You know I've gotten into tons of discussions and arguments about, especially when I was younger, because I was really into indie, kind of in indie's glory days, about whether or not a band is indie. And then a lot of times when bands would get popular, I remember especially there was a friend of mine, it was always a joke, but he would almost stop listening to a band if they became too popular. You know, and it's funny because my friends and I would always say, like, well, you can just listen to a band if you like the music, you know, but no, it would be like the second people would start hearing about the band, you would then automatically stop listening. You know, because in his eyes, they have now become too popular too big. So they don't really constitute being fitting in that indie category anymore. You know, I also think of bands like Arctic Monkeys. You know, they were huge right off the bat, but at the same time, there's still people that would constitute them. I don't know. They really.
Do you know about his strength and convictions? How she puts all her faith in religion? Did you take the time to really discover how little we know about each other? Leave us to change anything, can separate from everything. You talk to me, about yourself. Keep on saying anything, can separate from everything. Hands off, still reaches when you become
what's quote unquote normal thing. You know, when you really start seeing the difference in crowd, the difference in popularity and movement and so on and so forth. Because, you know, let's take a major person like Taylor Swift, you know, Katy Perry, Lady Gaga, you know, in fact, a lot of times a benchmark that you can really use with indie artists is, you know, have they performed at the
Thanks
Super Bowl
everybody, have a
halftime
great
show
night,
here in
alright!
America, right? Because if the answer is yes, well, you know, again, I almost guarantee you that those artists are not indie anymore, you know? And again, using my friend's example, the one that would stop listening to music, that's not even a bad thing if they are popular. You know, like why is a band being popular a bad thing? You know, they reach more and more people. I know a lot of times with people that listen to indie music, that's always a fight that they go with the band, right? Because they start thinking, well, I want more and more people to listen to this artist because they deserve more and more credit, more and more followers and listeners, but then they would almost be afraid for an artist to become, not become indie anymore, to become popular, because then they'll, again, in their mind's eye, they'll lose that label of being indie, and then again, they'll kind of lose who they are as a band. When I think of artists that fit this category, I think two of them really stand out, and that's Coldplay and Kings of Leon, where they had a huge run kind of before they got popular. Coldplay, I don't know, they're kind of on the fence. They did kind of get immediate success, but I do believe for a time they would have fit that indie description, but Kings of Leon's a good example, where they got quite a few albums in, kind of like the Black Keys as well. They got quite a few albums in before they quote unquote got discovered by a huge group of people, kind of like the mainstream media and your normal music listener. And then after that happened, they almost completely changed their sound, and that was, I don't know if it was to appease a major record label, if that was to appease the new fans that they got, and they were almost kind of embarrassed about their older music catalog, that they almost had to completely redo the way that they were seen as a band, and then if you were to ask people, like the hardcore fans of them before they got popular, a lot of times they stopped listening to that group at that point, because like my friend, in his example, they're almost sad that this group has changed their identity and become somebody different. Now, let's kind of dive into that theory that I talked about there, about it important even that a band becomes popular, because that's the biggest fight that people who listen to indie music have, is they're almost afraid for a band to get too popular, and then they have to change their sound essentially. A lot of artists kind of even fight against that idea. They say like, well, we're still ourselves. We still do everything the same as we've always done. So I don't know where that kind of romanticized idea is that a band changes their sound and then, they're not really seen as indie anymore. A lot of people too, they argue against that opinion because they're like, well, isn't that the point of making music, right? Like, you want more and more people to hear your song or your collection of songs, your albums. You want to tour from smaller venues to huge venues. That's the whole point of making music. And, a lot of times they argue against the kind of purist artists, who say like, well, I'm just here to make music, and I don't care if people listen or not. That's when people argue against that, and they're like, I don't really believe them, because again, isn't that the whole point of why they got started, was to reach more and more of an audience? And I definitely do think that's true, because it like nobody wants to just continue to perform at the extremely small, venues around the city. I'm sure that you guys all know that I'm talking about whatever city you grew up in. They want to perform in the huge, football stadiums, baseball stadiums, basketball arenas, whatever. They want to start performing there eventually, because then you're reaching more and more people, you're making more and more money. And I definitely think, no matter how selfish that sounds, all artists want to get there one day. There's not really a group of artists that they're fine with remaining at those smaller and smaller venues. However, there's nothing wrong with performing at those venues. In fact, I know for myself and a lot of people, we love the smaller venues and prefer them over those huge, massive venues that artists perform at. You know, like I used Coldplay as an example before. They're one of my favorite bands of all time. You know, I've stuck with them through thick and thin, you know, even through their weirdest, latest albums. And I think it's sad that more than likely I'm never going to be able to see them at like a smaller, you know, intimate venue. You know, there's no way. It would have to be like a massive arena in the nosebleed section. You know, and there's lots of artists like that, you know, where more than likely because of their popularity, they're never going to be able to perform in a small, intimate setting. You know, it's always going to be in a huge arena. And that brings me to one of the last and biggest points that I have about why indie music is so important. And that's because it keeps music pure as an art form. So let me backtrack to make this point into something that I brought way in the beginning of this video, right? And that was the movie industry and what's happening in the movie industry right now. You know, if you rewinded back before Disney bought everything, you know, before they bought Star Wars, before they bought Marvel, I remember at that time, everybody celebrated Disney doing that. Maybe Star Wars, that was a little bit iffy at that time, but I do think there was a large group of people that celebrated that happening. They were happy that Disney was doing that. And why was that? Well, they were happy because those franchises, you know, whether it be Marvel, whether it be Star Wars, whatever, they were now almost given an unlimited source of money to pursue their projects. Because you have to remember, before Disney got involved with Marvel, any superhero film was such a risky thing to do, right? Like I think of the early days of just Spider-Man and X-Men, you know, with 20th Century Fox and so forth. It was a risk for studios to make superhero films. But then Disney kind of gave them this huge safety net, being able to do that. And so, especially leading up to the Infinity Saga, it was this huge celebrated thing that Disney was able to do this because they were just pulling off something that had never been done before, right? Nowadays, though, what's happening with Disney, and let's use Marvel specifically. Well, audiences have kind of caught on, and nowadays people are almost begging for a return to form. I mean, number one, they're just begging for there to stop being so terrible superhero films nowadays. But a lot of people are starting to realize how, because now it's starting to happen beyond Disney, but how bad it is for these huge companies to have these holds almost on everything, every franchise that you can think of, because everything is starting to just gel into the same thing movie-wise. You know, it's every superhero film seems to just be following the same formula. Every single movie seems to just be trying to start up a franchise that you can expand upon into like 10, 20 movies. Even the way movies are written nowadays, there's too many jokes, there's not enough serious films, and, you know, again, it's just all seemingly the same everywhere that you go. And it's starting to show because a lot of the original idea films, you think of this year, 2023 in particular, one of the most popular films right now was the Barbie movie and Oppenheimer, which was extremely unique when it came to movies. And whereas a lot of the Marvel films and superhero films that were released this year just really tanked at the box office. And that is no accident. That is years of buildup now. And now it's starting to churn. There was a big prediction that I saw and I watched a YouTube video on this about where movies might be going in the future. And thanks for being patient with me, because I promise this is going back into indie music. But the prediction was one day, and it's probably going to be happening very soon, there's going to be a rise again in independent movie studios. And these huge bloated companies are going to start falling by the wayside because they won't be able to keep up with their demands to their investors, because already people are turning on those movies and not paying to watch them. Now, if you see what's even happening in music nowadays, it's extremely interesting. It's something that's not even talked about, that it's as much as movies are being talked about, is the music genre and what's happening in the music industry. Now, of course, major record companies are not nearly as recognizable as Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, so on and so forth, as those companies are. But it's interesting nowadays because other than kind of the phenomena of what's happening with Taylor Swift nowadays, a lot of major artists have seen a huge drop-off. Now, don't get me wrong. They are still very popular, when it comes to touring, when it comes to concerts, they get their money's worth. That is definitely true. But there has been a rise, and it's not even recently. It would have to be within starting the last 5 years, and I don't see really an end to it anytime soon. And that is the death of a record label, right? A lot of artists nowadays hesitate on making an entire album. What they would rather do is just make a single or release a lot of singles and kind of ride the popularity of singles rather than just focusing on an entire album. Now, don't get me wrong, albums are being released nowadays. They haven't ended yet. But I remember after watching that video about music's staying power, my brother and I were actually talking about this. And that is, a lot of times kids nowadays don't want to sit down and listen to an entire album. Music is just kind of seen as background music. It's something that they put on when they stream video games, when they stream videos for YouTube, when they're just, riding in a car, whatever. Because rather than, listen to a record or a CD like we did growing up, nowadays kids have an option to just watch videos. When they're going on appointments, they don't need to just sit there and listen to an album. They can watch YouTube. They can watch TikTok. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just how society is nowadays. But what that's doing is it's getting rid of the need for artists to really release an entire album. Plus, with technology nowadays, you don't need to wait to make an album. You can just release a new single whenever you want and get it out to the public as fast as possible. That also competes with artists nowadays needing to stay quote unquote relevant. In order for them to remain in the top 10, to remain in the public eye, they have to keep releasing new music. And rather than have to wait to release an entire new album, artists nowadays can just keep releasing singles and continue to stay in people's eyes and their attention. Now, whether or not that is right and whether or not you agree with that happening or with that being the right way to go for an artistry, I definitely think that's just a reality, the way that things are nowadays. And so why indie music is so important is indie music continues to just prop up the quality of the music that's being released. And that's the beautiful thing about indie artists is a lot of them do not care about this quote unquote pressure to keep releasing new music. Now, don't get me wrong, they love their fans and they want to release new music for their fans, but a lot of them just release music when they feel inspired to do so. Now definitely, yes, are there, some artists that are indie that, still remain just focused on popularity and financial income and advantage? Yes, don't get me wrong. But a lot of them, just like independent movie filmers and producers, still love the art of making music and just want to release albums when they feel inspired to do so. Recently, on this channel, I made a music video. I made a video on the music band The Hives. And they're a really interesting story because it's funny because I wasn't even really thinking about making a video about them until one day they had popped up on my YouTube feed and I saw that they had done a recent concert. On top of them doing an amazing job at said concert, I had wondered why I hadn't heard about them in a while. And when I researched it, and as I said in the video, they had gone almost 10 years between their last album and then their new one that they had released earlier this year. And the reason why is not because they didn't want to, they just had not felt inspired to make a new music album in a long time. They pretty much rode the success of their, I think it was 3 or 4 albums beforehand, and they just toured off of them, but they didn't really see a real need to make new music until they were inspired to do so earlier this year. What's really interesting is a lot of indie bands are starting to follow suit, and I don't know if it was because of COVID kind of giving everybody a chance to pause and kind of gather themselves, but I think a lot of indie artists are starting to kind of get the group back together again, and kind of say like, hey, we might have another album or 2 in us. Or they kind of realize, hey, wait a minute, why did we even break up in the first place? We should get this group back together again and continue to make music. I think it's a wonderful thing, and you need those small bands. You need those bands that only you and a handful of friends know about. You need those bands that only tour the small venues in the city. And maybe, yes, they do have dreams to play in, one of the biggest venues in your city or hometown. But they realistically continue to play at the state theaters, at the small palaces, at those venues with only like one name to it. You know what I mean? And they continue to do it maybe year in and year out and are just happy with the handful of fans that they have. What the future holds for indie music, honestly, in my opinion, I believe there is going to be an indie music renaissance. And I don't just mean indie rock. It can be hip hop. It can be rap. It can be country. It can be alternative, experimental, whatever. But I do believe that music itself, just like the movies, is at a reckoning. And the way that people are going about music and making it is going to change. But until it does change and kind of goes back and rebalances itself, I do believe that in the interim, indie music will continue to keep the backbone of the music industry in general going. Now, will it return back to its glory? I would say the last time indie became big was the early 2000s. Well, time will tell. I would love it if it does happen. But until that time, all of you continue to do what you're doing on this channel right now. Continue to talk about the beauty of indie music, especially in its heyday. Talk about indie music right now. Talk about the smaller bands that are just starting to get their feet underneath them. But don't forget about the bands that really brought us indie music as a whole when all of us were in our teenage years. Continue to support them at those small events. Continue to cheer them on. And I will see you guys all in the next episode.